Penguin Random House Audio presents The Churchill Complex, The Curse of Being Special, From Winston and FDR to Trump and Brexit, by Ian Buruma. Read for you by Simon Vance. For John Ryle. 1. Under the Sign of Victory. It seems to me that God, with infinite wisdom and skill, is training the Anglo-Saxon race for an hour sure to come. Reverend Josiah Strong, 1885. When the war is over, we shall live in an Anglo-American world. There will be other great powers, but the sanctions on which the West reposes will be the ideas for which England and America have fought and won, and the machines behind them. Cyril Connolly. I saw Winston Churchill on my 7th birthday in 1958. My grandparents took my younger sister and me to see Peter Pan at the Scala Theatre in London. When she wasn't too drunk to perform, Sarah Churchill played Peter. Quite often she played Peter while drunk as well. Once she audibly said, "Fuck," when she landed awkwardly after flying across the stage unsteadily on a wire. Nothing like that happened on the afternoon we attended the play, or if it did, I can't remember. What I do recall is the moment Sarah's father arrived. The memory is a kind of audio-visual blur. A pale face in the spotlight, a pudgy hand emerging from a firm muff to make the V sign, and everyone around me, including my very patriotic British grandparents, breaking into wild applause. The firm muff is a detail I know only from the photograph published in the papers the next day. Being Jewish, my grandparents felt strongly that Churchill had saved their lives. The extraordinary enthusiasm of that moment, the shining eyes and the raucous cheering for an old man in a theatre box, has stayed with me. It was a bit like watching adults behave like rowdy children, which fitted the story of Peter Pan in a way. The boy who never grew up. I must have had only a very vague idea who Churchill was, but reminders of the war were still around us. Waterlogged bomb craters all over London, drunken soldiers from the British Rhine Army throwing up on the ferry from the Hook of Holland to Harwich, and a steady diet of British comic books featuring dashing Spitfire pilots and beastly Germans. At home in The Hague, where I was born to a Dutch father, I assembled plastic Airfix models of Lancaster bombers. And British people we would meet at family parties in England still spoke to foreigners with a polite condescension that those who had lived through their finest hour still reserved for those who had been defeated. Recent history was experienced by people of my age. I was born just 6 years after the war, largely as myth, in which Churchill played an important part. We were allowed a day off school to watch his funeral in black and white on television. This was just another reminder that we had been liberated from the Germans by people who spoke English. Canadians finished the job in the early spring of 1945, but American and British troops, as well as Canadians, had already entered the country from the south in 1944 and were dropped in the autumn of the same year along the Rhine in the disastrous Battle of Arnhem. Polish troops had played a heroic part too, but this was not widely known. The language of freedom was English. Canadian troops were billeted in my paternal grandparents' house in Nijmegen near Arnhem. The women danced with their liberators to Glenn Miller's In the Mood. Hershey bars and silk stockings were liberally distributed in return for favours, which in many cases might have been granted anyway. And it was never forgotten that in the hunger winter of 1944–45, British and American bombers dropped onto a starving population bags of flour, corned beef, margarine, and chewing gum. My own perception of Europe's liberation, like that of most people of my age, was largely shaped by the movies. Some of the most powerful cinematic memories bear little relation to artistic quality or, indeed, historical accuracy. I still cannot watch The Longest Day, Darryl Zanuck's Hollywood reenactment of the D-Day landings, without weeping. All the Anglo-American stereotypes are there. Robert Mitchum, the macho Yankee chomping on a cigar while leading his men onto Omaha Beach. Sean Connery as a plucky Scottish private, Peter Lawford as Lord Lovat, accompanied by his own bagpiper. The very idea of a bagpiper playing under German fire is enough to reduce me to tears. John Wayne dropped from the sky over Normandy to sort things out, and Kenneth More, the unflappable Royal Navy captain, wading through the surf with his bulldog named Winston. If the ghost of Churchill hovered around my childhood in The Hague, its presence was felt even more keenly in Washington, D.C., and it lingered far longer. Presidents from John F. Kennedy to George W. Bush and beyond have hoped to follow the great war leader's example and save the world for democracy. His was the heroic myth they felt they had to live up to. So tenacious has the aura of Churchill been that a political row erupted in 2016 over his bust in the Oval Office when Donald Trump was about to move in. Trump's people placed a bust of Churchill in the office with great fanfare, claiming that President Obama had replaced it with a bust of Martin Luther King Jr. Boris Johnson, the British politician who expressed warm feelings for Trump, wrote a shallow hagiography of Winston Churchill, encouraging flattering comparisons to the author and would later become Prime Minister, attributed this swap to an ancestral dislike of the British Empire. In fact, the sculpture that Obama replaced had been loaned to George W. Bush by Tony Blair, while an older bust of Churchill, once given by Britain to Lyndon B. Johnson, was being repaired. Obama quite properly gave the new bust back, once the old one was restored. Now, the old bust perches behind the desk of Trump, whose scowl might be mistaken for an attempted impersonation of Churchillian gravitas. Churchill the man has been more popular in the US than his country ever was. Even presidents who had little time for the British revered Churchill. There are several possible reasons for this. Churchill's own belated sentimental feelings for the native country of his beloved mother, Jenny Jerome, from Brooklyn, New York, were often expressed in flowery speeches all over the US. His frequent references to the English-speaking peoples and Anglo-Saxon kith and kin no doubt appealed to Americans of a certain age and class. But Churchill's main attraction, I believe, lies in the same myth that coloured my childhood, which ties in closely to the view many Americans have of themselves. The beacon of liberty, the city on the hill, the land of the brave, the exceptional nation that freed the world from dictators. Churchill, although only half American, became the symbol of this defiance of tyranny. He is the bulldog face of Anglo-American notions of valour. Another ghost haunts Washington, D.C., as well as London, along with Churchill's. Indeed, the two are intimately linked. That is the ghost of Munich, the city where the British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain signed an agreement with Hitler in September 1938 that allowed Germany to take a chunk of Czechoslovakia with impunity. Chamberlain thought he had bought peace for our time. Churchill, speaking in Parliament, called it a total and unmitigated defeat. He thought this bitter cup could be averted only once Britain recovered its moral health and martial vigour, and arose again to take a stand for freedom as in the olden time. It is possible, as some maintain, that if Britain and France had taken that stand in 1938, Hitler's ambition of conquering Europe would have been thwarted. Others continue to argue that Chamberlain had no choice, since Britain was not ready to fight a war against Germany and the US was in no mind to get involved. But the mythical verdict, still repeated in political speeches and celebrated in the movies, is that Chamberlain was a short-sighted and cowardly appeaser, and Churchill the hero. Ever since, whenever a foreign crisis has loomed, from the Suez Canal to the Korean Peninsula, from Vietnam to the Falkland Islands, and from Bosnia to Iraq, the spectre of Munich is invoked by Anglo-American leaders who want to go down in history as Churchill, not Chamberlain. Churchill is often credited with coining the phrase special relationship. He certainly made it popular, if only to convince the Americans to come to Britain's rescue in the perilous early years of World War II. Since then, despite Churchill's mythical spirit living on in the White House, the Anglo-American relationship has been more special in London than in Washington. Given the growing gap in relative power and influence between the two countries, this was inevitable. Indeed, as Britain's power waned, clinging to the special relationship.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?